So we are back with Anthony Dyer. So can you talk us through the role of the AC-130?
Yeah. So the AC-130, the A, I think we mentioned last time, stands for attack, and then C for cargo, and the role of the AC-130, the gunship particularly, is to provide that timely and precise close air support for your unconventional forces. I think in the book I call them the super ninja types. Basically you're getting that close air support, sometimes even danger close missions, and what it provides is a lot of loader time, which is the reason it's used for that a lot of times, and then also just the deadly accuracy and the amount of ammunition and now bombs as well we have. So
Was it strictly like the guns, or would you actually like do any other missions on the AC-130?
yeah, we would do the missions. Like my I could go over my first mission there. This was the
Yeah.
old H model, the Spectre gunship, and what was cool about that one, again, it was like the same tail numbers like Vietnam, and so the same structure, the skeleton structure of the same men and women that flew during that era. So, but yeah, I was in Afghanistan in 2011 as my first deployment on the gunship, and then we'd done nothing for quite a while, and I remember we had landed from one operation. We basically just shot our tweak rounds, and what that is like, even with a 105, uh, just like any gun, right? You have to spend a few rounds to line your sights in, if you will. So same thing goes with the gunship, and we had landed, and then the pilot comes back to the gun deck, and basically had some products that he'd got, pretty much like from ops at that point, and said, "Hey, like, I know we just landed. Daylight's coming up, and there's a Green Beret team that's pinned down, right?" And he's like, who's with me?" And we all, of course, raised our hand and said, "Yeah, we'll do it. Daylight or not." And so I remember getting over the operation, and pinky time, like when the sun's coming up before morning nautical twilight, and I had my monocle NVG on. I remember I was like, "Well, don't need this anymore." And as soon as I did that, I remember like there's two bright flashes, two RPGs, and what it was three Taliban members that had explosive packs on shooting RPGs at the Green Berets, and I just remember thinking, like, after about 64 rounds, when it finally sets in, right, and like, man, I got to do more for my country in an hour and a half, 2 hours, and I'd done my whole life, and that was my whole why all those years in the gunship, why to make sure those guys get home.
And you mentioned there like the monocle. Did you have to get fitted for that, or was it like a small, medium, large kind of thing?
Yeah. So we have a aircrew flight equipment, AFE, for short, and they size your helmet and your mask, and then there was a sort of evolution. We went from like the monocle to scan with a monocle NVG to then we got the ones where they just flip them down as a scanner on the gun, on the gunship, your helmet, and they fall down in place. So yeah, everything's fitted to a T to each person, and our AFE men and women do a great job of making sure that's precise.
And did it ever fail, like when you were like in a mission or like on live ops?
Yeah, if my, let's say for example, if my NVGs like ran out of battery, that'd be user error on my part. So as you always had to, just like the aircraft, you'd pre-flight your flight equipment as well, your helmet, mask, make sure you can get your 100% oxygen if you need it, and then NVGs takes a minute to get your sights. Each eye is different and stuff like that. Yeah. So during the time when I was on the H model, so there was the H model Spectre gunship. We were based home side at Cannon Air Force Base, which is in Clovis, New Mexico, and then you had Herbert Field. That's where the AC-130U model was at the time, and the difference was they had the 25 millimeter Gatling gun as well as the same 40 and the 105 as we had.
I guess like going on live ops and stuff like that. I can't remember if we talked about it last time, but did you mix with crews, like, or did you stick with the same crew because everyone knew what you were doing, or was it like quite mixed there?
Yeah. You were basically what we call hard crew. So you were stuck with your crew. You train a little bit before the deployment with each other, and for the most part, there is exceptions. Somebody gets sick, hurt, etc. Um, you fly with the same 13 crew members, day in, day out, and a lot of that too is based on those flight hours, those 330 flight hours in 90 days, and it's
Mm.
easier, for leadership and management to manage, those hours and set you down when they need to keep from going over that.
In terms of like loading ammo, did you like was it loaders who like put the ammunition on, or was it you personally and the gunship or dog gunners who did that?
Yeah. So back then, we had ammo troops that would bring the ammunition out to the aircraft in a trailer, and then the right paratroop doors where we'd bring in our 40 mil, and I think it was approximately 265 rounds of that, and then 100 of the 105 rounds, and then 25 prox rounds, and basically you get this trailer all the way up to the as close as you can to the paratroop door where the doors can still open, and they hand you each 105. And yeah, it can get tiresome, if you don't sort of rest your arms in between,
Yeah.
45 pounds each round.
Ooh, that's quite a lot.
Yeah, yeah, it's a lot of weight. Yeah.
So, like, when you were loading up, like, for the AC-130, would there be any cargo on board, or would it be literally your job is that's it, the guns are in there, we can't have a car in or an armored tank or whatever?
Yeah, we didn't have any cargo other than the crew members, our bags
Right.
and then the ammunition. Yeah, and I think there was even a regulation that basically said the gunship will not be used to like transport people or materials. So just sort of it makes it singular to that purpose.
When you were going to shoot the gun, right, was it up to the pilot or was it up to you guys in the back?
Yeah, so what's awesome about Hercs in general, like or C-130s, is like there's really no rank on the aircraft, and
Yeah.
don't get me wrong, there is a A code, and that is the aircraft commander, and he's in the end, if a round leaves the aircraft, it's he or she's, they're signing off on that, right? But there is a very like everyone's opinion counts on the gunship, from you could be an A1C and you could have a colonel pilot, for example, and your input is just as important as the next guy's, and we always like have a saying like the JTACs, the guys on the ground, they own the rounds, but we own the switches. And, so there's often this conversation that happens within seconds, and to make the right call, whether it's safe or unsafe, the way we always looked at it.
And did you guys have to have like a debrief afterwards?
Yeah. After every shoot, especially on
Yeah.
shoots that you go extensively go over the shoot, and there's always what could have been done better, right? And that's the part of debrief and learning from that as an aircrew member, and the strengths and weaknesses of they really get sort of highlighted there, and you learn to work on those weaknesses, and there's usually like always something you can learn from each mission is the way I look at it.
And did you ever fire like where you felt it was necessary, but you had to do it, because of like the command above you, or like how did that work, Anthony?
No, so usually when we were engaged, and there was definitely a reason. I think last time a little bit about the troops in contact, right? Like our Americans and even British forces, for example. Then we positively identified right as hostile with weapons, and yeah, we're going to get cleared to shoot at that point.
Like you kind of mentioned before, but like, what kind of ammunition would you bring on board, and would you also would you have a personal, pistol on you as well?
Yeah, we all flew with the M9. Then we had M4s and the strapped down to the cargo ramp. God forbid somebody does a crash landing somewhere and have to evade and escape and all that stuff. But yeah, and as far as the ammunition of the rounds, we had 100 high explosive rounds. I mentioned, I think 45 pounds each there. And then you could set those to a different setting, what we call delay setting. And I think a good illustration of that would be like a structure, right? Like a building where, it goes through 12 inches of concrete and then detonates, and then we have this thing we could do we still do it, but it's called dual target attack. And another good illustration with that would be like a convoy, like, you'd hit one side, the other guy starts working on the other part of it. And then also if you were to hit a structure, for example, you could pump a delay in the structure and then have the 40 mil aimed at the time at the, the squirters, the guys running out the back. We had this different criteria, you check essentially every nick and cranny really fast, like the 105, for example, from the tip to the, where the fuse is at to the rotating band, all the way back to the primer, and so it's really, it's a lot to look at really quick, if that makes sense. Yeah. What was good about always, especially like bogging, right? We would land when the sun's coming up usually, and usually everybody would get chow first right before we debrief, and because it's going to take a while, and and then just basically think about what happened, and have my own debrief for myself, and then go into the actual debrief and go over every second of that mission, right? And then get the lessons learned, and then the biggest thing is tomorrow's always a new day, Yeah, so as far as like the social life, like downrange especially, we always had what you call a day room, and it's a common area, and back then in Afghanistan we had these B huts, these OSB board like plywood type huts that were constructed at one point, and we had a lot of gunners in one, for example, and a lot of sensor operators in another, and usually there was some sort of PlayStation or there was movies. We called it Licky Chewies. We had a whole closet filled with Rippets. I think I mentioned that in the book, the little energy drinks, and then protein bars, cereal, you name it. So there's a lot of pranks in that world, is part of it. So you learn to compartmentalize that, right? It's almost like a
Right.
switch. I always talk about the gunship, and especially when those engines get started, I always call it an arena, right? Like there's a saying we always had, like there's a lot of times everything's stacked against you, and like you'll hear the term, "Whoa, just be an athlete," right? Your instructor will say, "Whoa, just be an
Yeah.
athlete," and
Yeah.
to me, it was always the same thing as like a Notre Dame football player running out. It says play like a champion tonight. And in the 16th, we had this thing in Old English that says, on the door before you walk out with your helmet and bag, is, we who walk through these portals stand tall. So that was always my mental part, like where I would check myself, whatever I had going on in my life, like it didn't matter. There's those operators depend on your close air support. And that's the way I looked at it. And when I turned it off, when I got back, I turned it off. Yes, I would say I was 29. Was that, yeah,
Wow.
11 years? But yeah. So 29 years old on my first mission there, and yeah, it was. It's one of those things that when you first get out there, even as a firefighter, we had what you call anticipating the call, right? Like you want to do your job, and I get it. Like a lot of these are jobs you never want to have to do, but like you would, like in my mind, I'd be like, "Is today the day? Today the day?" And then when it happens,
Mm-hmm.
there's this almost like you first shoot like a rite of passage, right? And like I
Mm-hmm.
call it baptism by fire, and just to be accepted in something that's bigger than myself. That was, to me, that was everything. And I never lost really that feeling of the relevance of the why behind the gunship. And there's letters around that squadron where I think I mentioned where Ranger's holding his baby girl, and he thanks the gunship, the 16th, for the rounds. So he got to go home and see his baby girl. And you really don't think about those letters when you're young, but when you're older and you look at them different with a family, right? So that was always relevant to me. So my first was 8 deployments, and 8 or 9 deployments. I wasn't married yet, and
Right.
I had my kid. 2016, I went to helicopters at that point in my career. But yeah,
Yeah. Oh.
I was married. Yeah, and I met my wife actually when I was stationed at Cannon the first time she was going to college. So I tell people with wives though, like it's when we sign up for this life, they sign up for it too, and there's a quote by one of the old OSS guys that basically says, special operations is a mistress. It'll rob your time. It'll wake you up in the morning at 3 a.m. and
Yeah.
in the end, it'll choose you for a younger man, right? So to me, that always summed up special operations in a nutshell. There was definitely like I talked about my first shoot, and then all the rest of my shoots were at night, and there was different. Let's say, for example, like this guy's like approaching a convoy. I remember he's in a motorcycle, right, and there was an escalation of force sometimes, right, and basically, when he would get with a certain distance from the convoy, we had this thing called a green beam, and it's really cool if you've never seen it, but it's this big, huge green laser that we would shoot out, and
Yeah.
you could imagine, imagine being in Afghanistan, right, like biblical level, like sort of time error right there is what it feels like, and you got this green light coming down saying, "Hey, like we could see you," and then he would turn around, and then there was missions where like before we even got on scene, right, like the JTAC and the team had been getting shot at, and they'd already give you a 5 line for close air support, and there's this thing that was always common, like they would, especially the Taliban, they feared the gunship, and they would hear your props, your four fans of freedom. You get miles out, and they start running, weapons in hand, just because they knew at that point it's over. There's the motto for the squadron: you can run, but you only die tired. And that's a very true thing with a gunship. And then there's some missions where like even like I remember being overhead these Marines, man, and like with a noise signature, like they hadn't slept in days, and we just orbited, and
Mm.
they got 4 hours of sleep, and actually got to talk to a guy about that, and that you never really know how much that means to somebody, just keeping the enemy at bay so they can sleep.
So when you're going into theatre, did you ever get like fighter escorts, like, or could you defend yourself?
Yeah. I don't ever remember having a escort. For the gunship, a lot of times we would never put ourselves in a situation where the surface to air threat is that high, right? Like
Hmm.
but there was moments, especially with ISIS, like you would see surface to air fire a lot, and some sort of AAA. And I remember like they would always shoot at our noise, right? And it was black at night,
Hmm.
and you'd look at 6 o'clock and see these, basically beach ball size, airbursts, right? And but at that point, we saw the point of origin, or the poo, if you will, and and it was over for them. If they shot at us, it was basically suicide for them for our self defense. So.
Mm-hmm. And did you ever work with the Apache guys or even the Cobra guys? When you're on the missions.
Yeah. I think I often tell people I got caught blocked more by the Apaches, and as far as getting us cleared to shoot more than any other airframe. But yeah, those guys are awesome, and they got that on point with that 30 mil. But we worked with them quite a bit with integration and stuff. Yeah, so the gunners, we didn't really get on the radios. It was usually back then the navigator. The navigator would talk to the joint terminal air controller, which is usually right beside your ground force commander. And the navigator, I remember there was this guy, and man, he was on the Roberts Ridge shooting. He actually gave me that book my first trip, and he's like, you should read this book. This is what basically the gunship's all about, and a really awesome guy. And he just had a way to just narrate, to paint a picture with his words to the JTAC, because often they can't see what you're looking at, and he always made it so clear, just a talent. Yeah. I'd often tell people, for your home nation, partying with the Brits is a life altering experience, and every now and then they would come to Canada and we would practice the calls for fire with them and stuff. And yeah, we worked with the Brits, the Aussies, the Polish at one point. I remember that. Nice. Yeah, so it's you do these exercises. Actually, one's coming up called Emerald Warrior, and you all train together with these different nations. The Brits would bring some form of alcohol to us in the bar there. It would have it was always something like that. We would trade back and forth. We have a paddle I got a paddle from SEAL Team 3. We put it in the squadron there. Nice. To the squadron, and then there's all kinds of. You walk through the hallways, man. There's anything from Noriega's machete, right? From that, and then there's a picture of the Pink Palace they leveled during the first of the war there, stuff like that.
And there's obviously a lot of photos out there of the AC-130, particularly dropping out flares. How many flares could the AC-130 carry, and were they actually effective?
Yeah, I can't comment on how many exactly, but they were effective. Yeah, I would sum it up. God's right hand. I think it's often referred to as God's chariot, and I'd call it God's right hand, because in the end, man, I say especially with ISIS and all that stuff, I was like, all it is for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing. And when the AC-130, you're flying with the best men and women the Air Force has to offer. And I compare it to being surrounded by 4 quarters over 100 pennies, right? Like you're getting an iron sharpens iron type of mentality in each crew member.
We've kind of answered this one, but what was it like firing the gun?
Yeah, so firing the gun, it was the first time it happened. I actually spoke about that moment in the book there. So for the 105, that's probably the most asked about, but you have this 45-pound round, basically if you put a tank cannon on the side of a cargo aircraft, that's what you got. So you throw it in the breech, you close the breech, you slave it, which means it's trainable, which means the sensor or whoever's running the sensors can aim it. And then you arm it. That's the last thing that it needs before it goes boom, And then you have now it's a CISO and WISO. Back then it was 2 enlisted sensor operators, but they're the one that quote unquote actually hits the trigger, right? But in the end, everybody has an armed safe assembly to where you can inhibit that fire, right, for a ceasefire or something like that. And it recoils, up to 49 inches, but I think 43, 44 inches is about average. And so you could imagine you're at this tilt like NASCAR with guns, right? And this gun recoils up to 49 inches. It's just an awesome experience. And what the beautiful part about it is it takes back then 13 crew members working simultaneously to do their job in this organized chaos to get these rounds out. So it was awesome. And every now and then we get to lanyard fire the 105, so you turn into a flying artillery guy, right? And you tie basically some parachute cord or 550 cord to the firing pawl, and you'd get the ready pull call, boom, and pull it. So firing the 105 that's a life altering experience as well. So
this is a really interesting one, and I think I probably know the answer here, Anthony. Did you have aircon on the AC-130?
Yeah, we did. But here's the thing on the Ace model. So we didn't pressurize, man, and so I got a funny story about this. Actually, I was my first trip was approaching winter in Afghanistan. It gets really cold, especially thousands of feet in the air, and I remember there was these heat ducts between the 40 and the 105, and I was so cold and that I took the duct, the square part off the heat tube, and basically I got in the 40 mil bag and I aimed the heat down in there, my lead gun he's a funny story, and he was like, man, yeah, he's like, man, I'm freezing up here. He's like, engineer, put some logs on, meaning more heat, right? And he's like, man, I'm freezing. I was like, man, I'm actually sweating back here. And he's like, lead gun's checking off. He goes back and he sees me in this 40 mil bag, like with the tube in the to heat myself up. And I took his heat, everybody's heat, right? So yeah, I got to go in for that one, man. Yeah, so we had spent cases, and back then we had this big, like 55, like aluminum barrel, you'd put them in, and basically had a cargo strap over the top of that to strap it down. And there's times too, like if it's hot and heavy and you're really shooting a lot of rounds, like you clean up later, man. You make sure the gun can still shoot, and you put them wherever you can to get them out of the way. And those things are hot when they come out when you're shooting that many.
Next one. Did you ever take any rounds from the shots you fired?
No, I never kept like an actual like live round or nothing like that. And I have kept some spent cases. I got when I retired. From the squadron there, but yeah, it was just a retirement type thing.
If you could go back on to the AC-130 or the Pavehawk, which one would you choose?
If I'm being honest, like I get this question a lot, like which ones was my favorite, right? And it's so hard to compare because I compare one to like a quarterback, right, and not one to like a defensive, cornerback, right? But flying wise, there's nothing, I got to be honest, nothing funner than flying on a Pavehawk helicopter, shooting a minigun on white phosphorus MVGs, man. That's just, as an enlisted guy, that was awesome,
Yeah, and last one, how many hours did you get on the AC-130?
I think so. I had 2,700 between all of them, so about 2,000, just shy of 2,000, I believe, was on the AC-130s. Yeah,
that's incredible.
Yeah, and a lot of it too was like a lot of people realize when we first started hitting ISIS, that there was like 11.7, almost 12-hour missions sometimes. It's because you would hit the tanker twice within a sortie, man. You get back from that, you don't want to do nothing but sleep. To sort of get at your question earlier about relaxing, like a lot of times you're so tired you don't have time to think about it. Yeah, so we had a convection oven on the H model. It was awesome, and we had MREs that we would keep on the plane, and like a lot of times people would like get all the good MREs first, and you'd be left with like something terrible. But yeah, so the DFAC would give us like the Red Baron pizzas you could heat up,
Yeah.
And we would put them in there, and I would do this weird science to where like what altitude we were at versus like what I needed to be cooked at, So I would almost, go through the aisleway like coffee tea or me, like a flight attendant, offer Red Baron pizzas. Yeah, that's a good question though. And then there's a lot of times the MREs, I would actually, if I didn't want to walk up front to heat it up, I would take the pack out, and the auxiliary pump with the hydraulic fluid had a slot, like a little gap. It would fit perfect in there, and that the heat from that, if you turn the aux pump on, would heat up my MRE. So you find ways to get creative, and eat. Yeah, it's doing really well, and thanks to you guys' platforms, and let me talk about the story there. But you can find it. It's called Moonchild: The Roots and Wings of a U.S. Air Force Combat Specialist and Aviator, and you can find it on Amazon or Barnes and Noble. And my publisher has a site called Trademarker Media that has a link right to it.
But thank you very much, mate. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, brothers. You have a Merry Christmas as well, all you guys.